Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Juan de Lara. I am the director of the Latinx and Latin American Studies Center at USC. Our center brings together faculty, students, and community partners to engage in interdisciplinary research and public-facing scholarship that focuses on Latino communities within the United States and in Latin America. We celebrate the diversity of Latinx and Latin American communities while engaging in scholarship that addresses important social and economic issues. Our hemispheric approach necessitates a mode of research that crosses as many borders, cultural, political, and disciplinary, as do the people of the Americas. Before we get started today, I want to give a special thanks to Kathleen Calderon, who is a research assistant for the center and has essentially put this event together. So thank you very much, Kathy. Today, we are here to talk about Johana Londoño's book. And before I introduce her, I also want to introduce George J. Sánchez, who will be moderating the conversation today. George J. Sánchez is a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and of History at the University of Southern California. He is one of the most preeminent U.S. historians who focuses on Los Angeles and on Chicano history. He has published one of the most important books in the field, Becoming Mexican American, Ethnicity, Culture, and Identity in Chicano Los Angeles between 1900 and 1945, published by the University of Oxford Press. His most recent book, Boyle Heights, How a Los Angeles Neighborhood Became the Future of American Democracy, was just recently published this year by UC Press. He has a long list of accomplishments, and we'd be here all day if I read those. But I just want to thank George for agreeing to moderate today's discussion. Johana Londoño is Associate Professor in Latin American, Caribbean, and US Latino Studies and in Sociology at the State University of New York in Albany. Her research interests Latino-Latina urban culture in the US, political economy of cities, comparative ethnic studies, social and cultural theory, representations of poverty, social welfare, the cultural politics of architecture and urban design, and aesthetics and visual culture. We are here, of course, today to discuss her fantastic new book, Abstract Barrios, The Crisis of Latinx Visibility in Cities, that was published by Duke University Press. So please join me in welcoming both George and Johana to today's conversation. Okay, George, it's all yours.
Okay, let me just frame our discussion a little bit. I think Johana's book does an incredible job of thinking through the complexities of modern Latino presence in urban cities. I think traditionally, we've often thought about questions of inclusion. And in that manner, one of the standard ways to think about where do Latinos play a role in bringing forward into the city a Latino presence. And I think Johana's book, more than any other book that has been recently published, kind of questions that thinking on the part of those of us that think a lot about cities, and does it in a lot of interesting ways and across the entire country. Johana, I wanted to start by asking you some questions about really your title, because I think it provokes a number of things. And one of the central kind of themes throughout the whole book that you make is the difference between thinking about barrios and the Latinization of cities in more modern time. Could you tell us a little bit about kind of why you make that distinction and how that plays out into the central themes of your book?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I mean, before I continue, I just want to thank you, Professor Juan de Lara and Kathleen Calderon for organizing this event. And thank you, Professor George Sánchez, for being in conversation with me. I've long admired your contributions to the field of urban history and Latinx studies, and it's just so wonderful. I'm honored to be here with all of you. So for me, there is a distinction between the Latinization of cities and barrios. Barrios, as I come to see them, and as I think they have been overwhelmingly defined throughout the 20th century and 21st century in the United States, are working class spaces, Latinx settlements in US cities. The Latinization of cities, however, can take on different forms and don't necessarily occupy those working class spaces and aren't necessarily made for working class people, low income, marginalized folks, or by them, right? So the Latinization of cities, that particular framework opens up the question of who gets to represent Latinx culture in the built environment. And as the book shows, it's sometimes folks who are in a position of power, right? Either they have professional status or they are public officials, some of them non-Latinx public officials. They're urban planners and urban designers. Some of them have some sort of connection to working class barrio spaces, others do not. But they all have some sort of connection, and that's that they want to represent Latinidad in the built space. To what extent and for what purpose, that becomes a much larger question, right? And that's part of what I'm trying to unpack in the book. It's those power hierarchies that are sometimes not really legible to us when we see and only think about what we are seeing in barrios or in spaces that convey some sort of Latinx culture. So for me, the barrio is distinct from, but influences the Latinization of cities.
Thank you so much. One of the concepts that I really like has to do with your title, and that's the concept of abstract barrios. And I think somewhere in the book, I took this quote out that abstract barrios are an attempt to lessen the nervousness that barrios provoke. Can you talk more about that concept of abstracting the barrio?
Yeah, sure. So this term abstraction for me really comes out of several fields. Art history is one of the major fields that has talked about abstraction and art in general. But also, you know, Marxist analysis of capitalism have also talked about abstraction. So when I think of abstraction, I'm thinking about an abstraction that is, for one, curating, right? A sort of selection process by which someone takes certain elements of a culture and those elements begin to represent the very specifics of those culture, but in very vague kind of ways. Abstraction can also mean the ways in which some creatives visualize things in ways that are removed from the burden of representation, right? So instead of something that's very figurative, it becomes much more general. And then abstraction can also mean a form of universalization, right? Of a generalization that is done in part to maximize an exchange value, right? The dollar, right? Money being a form of abstraction. And it can also, in that process of deletion, of taking away from very specific contexts, it can also act as a loss, right? And so I take all of these definitions of abstraction to understand the ways in which individuals who have the power to represent Latinx culture in urban space and who have that power and whose power is not questioned, right? It goes unquestioned. How they use that in a way that begins to resemble an abstraction of those barrios, right? An abstraction that leads to alternative forms of Latinization of cities. And so I'm using this term abstraction to convey to the reader the process by which these individuals, who I sometimes call brokers in the book, are creating new forms of Latinization of cities that are inspired by the barrio, but not necessarily always reduced to the barrio, right? And for various reasons, either they want to make money out of those particular forms, or they're really interested in challenging the white normativity of their professions, and in doing so, seeking a compromise between the professional pressures that they face and this need, this desire to represent Latinx culture in, say, urban planning or architecture or some other urban design field.
If I could have you continue with that discussion about these brokers of Latino culture. I'm interested in, one of the strengths of your book is the wide coverage of these brokers and the long history of the people that you mention having brokered Latino culture, going all the way back to the sort of Puerto Ricans of the 1950s, the people who brokered Puerto Rican culture on the East Coast in the 1950s, all the way through some fairly contemporary Latinx urban planners, people who've been very active as political figures. Could you give us a sense of that diversity of those brokers and how you yourself kind of judge their activity vis-a-vis the communities that they work in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I should say that one of the things that inspired the book was the fact that I was in design school as an undergraduate student. And as an emerging designer, I guess one could say, I sort of wanted to be a broker, right? I sort of wanted to be the kind of professional that I analyze and examine in the book. I wanted to bring in more Latinx representation into these fields of urban design and two-dimensional design that continue to be overwhelmingly non-Latinx white. I mean, some of these professions, especially architecture and urban planning, are nearly 90% white, non-Latinx white. So for me, being in these spaces, I always was interested in how can we diversify these spaces, right? And so I was initially attracted to the broker because I wanted to learn more about their initiatives for increasing the diversity of these fields, which I think is really important because these are the folks who are oftentimes in charge of managing and manipulating our visual landscape, everything that we see around us, right? So I started with the intention of examining contemporary brokers, right? And that's why in one of the chapters, I interview Henry Cisneros, the former secretary of HUD, who also has an urban planning background, and as many of you know, also has a lot of background in urban policy as the former mayor of San Antonio. And I also interviewed Henry Munoz, who is the head of one of the largest design firms in Texas. He's also based out of San Antonio. And I interviewed James Rojas, who has he's been around for a long time, and he has really been promoting, and he's based out of Los Angeles. He's been promoting this idea of Latino urbanism for a while now, for several decades. And so I was interested in knowing more about what their contributions were to their specific design fields, architecture, urban planning, urban policy, et cetera. But then the more research I did, I realized that what I was examining was not something that could only be talked about in the contemporary moment. As I think some scholars have pointed out, I can mention, for example, anthropologist Arlene Davila, who examines a very similar process in East Harlem about the Latinization of cities, which is done for gentrification purposes, right? And she ties it very much to a neoliberal period, right? A very contemporary period. But the more research I was doing, I realized that actually there's more history to this, right? That we can trace this to various moments of the 20th century, going as far back. My earliest example in the book, Puerto Rican Lower East Side, right? And how brokers there, specifically settlement workers and public officials and local elites, were trying to use aesthetics, right? The aesthetic manipulation of built space in order to distract from this notion that Puerto Ricans were a threat to the modern city, a threat to the modernization of New York City in the 1940s, 1950s. So I realized that in order to tell this story, I wanted to tell a much longer history of it, even though I was not trained as an urban historian, right? I was trained as an American Studies scholar with multi-methodological, interdisciplinary sort of background.
One of the things that I think also helps root this, the whole book, is your own background. Growing up in Union City, and particularly the way that you start the book in talking about walking around Union City and the city that you came to know. So I'm very interested in what your take is on your own background growing up in an urban space. And you've mentioned kind of your own growth as a scholar, but I guess I'm interested in kind of growing up as a Latina in urban space, and what you feel you've drawn from that helps inform the book.
Yeah. So I should say that when I started graduate school, and actually my last few years in college, some of the scholarship that I found really compelling was the scholarship that was discussing Latinx built environments as forms of contestation, as a sort of resistant to dominant forms of urbanization, resistant to displacement, resistant to quote unquote revitalization. The scholarship, for example, on Puerto Rican casitas in New York City, scholarship that has been put together by Professor Luisa Ponte Pares, but Professor Dolores Hayden also talks about this as a form of sort of Lefebvrean counter space, right? I was also fascinated by the way that people were talking about, scholars in particular, were talking about murals, right, in California as resistant to these forms of displacement, right? And that's the kind of scholarship that galvanized me, right? That's the kind of scholarship that got me really interested in being an academic. And that's kind of what I wanted to find in my own neighborhood, right? In the barrio that I grew up in Union City. But then I realized that I couldn't find it because the forms of Latinization there were very much created from the top down, right? These were forms of Latinization that weren't necessarily counter to dominant policies that were there to oftentimes marginalize the already very marginalized population. And so I wanted to bring nuance to that scholarship. I wanted to better understand who gets to Latinized cities. And so I start the book with a preface that is very much personal, and it documents sort of my mother's experience with urban vulnerability, I guess one might say, housing vulnerability, as someone who relies on subsidized housing vouchers, or otherwise known as Section 8 vouchers. And so I wanted to tell this story because I wanted to tell the reader, right, that even though much of the book is focused on these powerful figures, right? People who have some sort of position of power, who can talk about the built environment and shape the built environment in ways that are not as questioned or as stigmatized, right? That even though I'm talking about those folks, the stories of the most marginalized and precarious residents are the stories that are shaping my analysis and my examination of those power brokers, right, of those brokers of the barrio. So there's definitely a lot that influences this work, right? And hopefully the reader gets it, right? That even though there is this long tradition in Latinx studies, right, of focusing on the most marginalized residents, on those residents who claim power and are able to resist, that we also need to tell these other stories in order to have a more nuanced understanding of what happens on the ground, right? And how these built environments begin to shape and take form.
One of the things that marks this book, and I think it's indicative of a pattern that's increasing in Latinx studies, is that it's kind of both. It's about two different places geographically, right? You've got these wonderful chapters on New Jersey and New York, and the East Coast, and then you've got these chapters that concentrate more in the Southwest, and the one I'm particularly thinking about is the one on Santa Ana. And I guess I'm wondering, as you know, more and more books are making these cross-national perspectives. Could you say a little bit about what brings them together for you in the book, and then what might distinguish each place? Is there anything that you found that more dominates in one location as opposed to the other, or is it mostly that they're connected by kind of the central thesis of your book?
Yeah, thanks. So I from the get-go, I wanted to bring in several case studies. I wanted to look at several neighborhoods and not exclusively the place that I grew up in, because you know, my neighborhood, Union City, New Jersey, is very small. It's about 60,000 people, and it's even though I think it's a really interesting place to examine, I think that it would have been difficult for people to sort of relate to the project if I were to only focus on Union City. But also, I was really interested in making this more of a national kind of nationwide based research, so that I can get to these broader patterns across not only time, but also across space. And I came to Santa Ana early on in the research because Santa Ana was in the news as an example of Latino new urbanism in the early 2000s. And that's how I first began to learn about Santa Ana and realized that I had to travel down there and get to know the folks down there and get to just do more research on why Santa Ana was being considered a special example of quote unquote Latino new urbanism. And then as I did more research, I began to be more interested in San Antonio, Texas, because two of my interviewees are based out of San Antonio, Henry Cisneros and Henry Munoz. And then I also began to learn about what was happening in Lower East Side, and sort of began to be more interested in that particular neighborhood. But I should say that I think there are a lot of other neighborhoods that could have been included, right? Chicago could have been included. Los Angeles could have been included. Miami could have been included, right? I don't think it's exhaustive, but these are the sort of places that I was most interested in focusing at the particular time that I was developing the research. I will say that one of the challenges of doing this research across all of these places had to do with the methods that I used, because what I discovered is that record keeping in Latinx communities is very uneven, right? So whereas in Santa Ana, California, there were more archives at my disposal, and there were a lot more people who were organized in community centers, who had been organized around immigration issues. I knew how to locate them. I was able to come to their gatherings and find people to talk to. That was in the case in my own neighborhood, right? And in the city that I grew up in, people were much more dispersed. There were no community organizations and there were no archives. Right. And then the Lower East Side of New York City, Puerto Rican Lower East Side, there were archives not only in New York, multiple archives in New York, but there were archives in Minnesota. I mean, there were archives in New Jersey. There was just so much there for me to draw on, right? And so I think that became very clear from the beginning, that was going to be one of the major distinctions, right? My access to materials and the kinds of methods that I was going to use in each particular place.
One of the things that comes up a lot in the book, and I found it fascinating, is the issue of color and the role of color in defining the Latinization of spaces across different brokers. That seems to be one of the themes that seems to connect some of these sites, or at least connects a use of when you enter a space and you can identify it as Latino, it has something to do with color. Can you say more about that, and how you use color as a way of understanding what's going on in urban space?
Sure, yeah, so this is a focus of chapter 2, though it is present throughout the entire book. For me, color is one of the main ways that brokers abstract from the barrio. It is one of those forms that speaks to barrio formations, but isn't necessarily reduced to barrio formations. And it has a very long history, right, of either being this way to claim Latinx authenticity, or as being this way to stereotype Latinx people and Latinx culture, right? And I do a brief history of bright color specifically in chapter 2, where I write about the ways in which it was used to render these colonial narratives of Latinidad that continue to persist today. And I talk about how color is a form of distraction, right? It's seductive. It distracts from the real life that's happening in the barrios. But it's also oftentimes so very much associated with our identity that it's hard to just push it aside and say, no, it's not part of us, right? And so I think that brokers sometimes use color in order to try to represent Latinidad, while also trying to obfuscate the kind of community realities that it speaks to. So we see this in chapter 2, specifically towards the end, in gentrified spaces, or spaces that are gentrifying, where architects, designers are using bright color to commemorate the particular neighborhood that they're gentrifying, while also participating in the very displacement of that neighborhood, right? So I have, I believe, a photo, an image of a condominium that was built in San Francisco in the Mission District. And the designer for that particular condominium was drawing inspiration from the Chicano murals that were created in that neighborhood. And the way that he sought to continue the visual representation of the neighborhood was just with flat color, flat, bright color, right? That spoke to the murals, but weren't exactly the murals, right? And so the color begins to tell the narrative of displacement, the narrative of stigmatization, and the kind of normative Latinization of cities that appeals to people in power, right? Public officials, real estate agents, et cetera.
So one last question for me before we open it up to the audience. you've mentioned this already, but I want you to, I know we have several graduate students who are in the audience who are, have visions of multidisciplinary approaches that your book sort of exemplifies. You've talked about being in the archives. You did obviously a number of interviews. I even love the opening part where you talk about the importance of walking the neighborhood. Could you kind of really directed at them, what lessons have you learned about doing this multiple methods for this kind of a book that for someone starting their career and having some aspirations to do multiple methods, what advice would you give a beginning graduate student who sees that as a model for what they'd like to do?
Yeah, right. So I think my number one advice is to not go into your research thinking that you know which methods you're going to use. I remember hearing one of my faculty mentors at NYU say that in American Studies, we start with the research problem or the research question, and then we decide on our methods. We don't start on our methods first, right? We don't settle on our methods and then go to a research question or a research problems. The methods come to us as we start examining what we're interested in. And that's sort of the path I took, right? At first I was doing interviews, and then I realized I had to go to the archives. I had to go to the Smithsonian Design Archive in New York City. I had to look at this archive in Minnesota, but it wasn't necessarily in my dissertation proposal, right? That's not something that I knew from the start I was going to do, but it just sort of happened as I was doing the research. So I think allow yourself the flexibility while you're doing your research to think about various methods that will answer your research question, right? That will answer that will get to the core of that problem that you're seeking to unpack. Hopefully that helps. I don't know if that was as thorough as it could have been, but
no, I think it helps a lot. It's a wonderful book, a wonderful achievement. I just wanted to make sure that you know that, and it's already on the list of all my classes here at USC, particularly my Latino historiography class. I just want to kind of congratulate you. I think it's time to open it up for other questions. I'll let Juan get back involved with us.
Great, thank you both. We are going to invite those of you who want to ask questions to become one of the panelists. That doesn't mean you have to be front and center, but if you ask a question, if you join as a panelist and accept that invitation, you can come into this kind of inner room and ask your question directly. And also it'd be nice for George and Johana to be able to see you all. Right now they cannot see you. So if you would please join us, that would be fantastic. And then if you have a question, please raise your hand and we will get to you. Does anyone have any questions? I have lots of questions, but I'm going to wait unless we need to fill time. Joan, you're on mute.
Hi. Sorry, I'm like in my kitchen also making lunch because that's our Zoom world.
Yeah. Why don't you introduce yourself and then ask the question?
Yeah. Hi, Johana. I'm Joanne Flores. I'm an assistant professor in the history department, and I work on Black women's migration in the Caribbean and Panama and labor and other stuff. And I was so excited to be here for your talk, and your book is so wonderful. I wanted to ask you, so as somebody who works on Afro-Latinos, and also I'm becoming like increasingly interested in kind of white conservative Latinos, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, some of what you're tracking is this kind of creating these allegiances to white values, right, and to whiteness through these urban processes. But I was trying to, this is not like a wonderfully formulated question. I was just trying to think about how this is different in places like Little Havana or other neighborhoods where there are predominantly white or light-skinned Latinos, or groups of Latinos who are actively trying to engage with whiteness politically and, you know, so on and so forth, right? Where that investment is coming from a different place versus something like Puerto Ricans in the Lower East Side, which was nevertheless about keeping a kind of like distinct Puerto Ricanness, right? So I was just wondering if you had some thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I would say that a lot of the aesthetic solutions that I examine in the book as a sort of a response to this anxiety that elites and specifically whites have about the formation of barrios in the Lower East Side of Manhattan or Union City or Santa Ana has to do with creating aesthetic manipulations of built space that are white adjacent, right? That serve as sort of a proxy for whiteness, right? And so the bright colored built environment serves as a proxy to whiteness because that is what we expect white audiences to accept as a form of Latinidad, right? And we see this in the Lower East Side of Manhattan with Puerto Ricans saying, you know, one of the best ways to incorporate Puerto Rican culture into public housing in the 1950s and 1960s is to bring Spanish architecture, right, as representative of Puerto Rican architecture. And we see this happening in other parts of the country as well. In Union City, New Jersey, for example, we see how Latinidad, the representation of Latinidad in the built environment, is oftentimes at odds with the incoming Afro-Cuban population, right? Especially in the 1980s with the Mariel boat lift. And so I imagine that something similar is happening in Little Havana in Miami, right? But the Little Havana I'm doing most of my research on is in Union City, right? The Havana on the Hudson. And so that's what I'm seeing happening there, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, right? That these white Latinx folks, or folks who want to hold the power of whiteness, right? Are trying to manipulate the built environment in order to secure their belonging to the city. And in doing so are creating forms of expression that are acceptable, right? That are sometimes in dialogue with long submarine stereotypes of Latinidad. So I'm sorry, I don't know that I answered your question about Little Havana and Miami, but
No. It wasn't so much about Miami. That was just me. That was a great answer to a bad question. So
I will say that Joanne looks a lot more relaxed now that the book manuscript is in. So it's good to see. Okay, does anyone else have any questions? Anybody in our audience? I have a question that I want to ask. And if you do have a question, please do raise your hand. I was intrigued by the book and what you said earlier today, Johana, about the issue, you know, your background in design, right? And over the summer, I read Arturo Escobar's book, Designs for the Pluriverse. And I'm not sure if you are familiar with that. But, you know, he speaks a lot about this issue about design as world making. And design as it exists now in urban landscapes as the way that modernity is essentially built the built environment. And so if you juxtapose all of the stuff that you've been talking about now with your initial interest as kind of counter mappings, right, of space, and the way that people like James Rojas have talked about Latino urbanism. I'm wondering how, sort of in the context of the work that you've done, when you speak to people like Henry Cisneros, who is very much in line with this idea of world making from the sense of modernity and planning in time, that whole field is based on that. how and where the spaces are created to generate the kinds of counter mappings that, you know, you had been hearing about Santa Ana that might have been promising, and then in the end, whether you found the promise to actually be realized or not, or whether it was being subsumed by the work of modernity and planning.
Thanks so much, Juan. Yeah, I think for the most part, the examples that I focus on in the book are focused on these modernist or modern ideals of what urbanism should be, right? But while also trying to incorporate Latinx culture, right? So they're not necessarily from the start thinking of themselves as counter projects, right? They're not trying to map out a counter to the urban planning or the urban policy paradigms that have shaped modern urban life, right? So in Santa Ana, California, for example, Fiesta Marketplace is created by public officials, business owners, and some local developers in order to counter white flight, right? In order to bring back some of the whites that had left, while also realizing that they have to cater to a growing Mexican population that is settling in Santa Ana, and that represents a large portion of their consumers, a large percentage of their consumers. But Santa Ana, California, eventually, well, specifically Fiesta Marketplace in Santa Ana, California, eventually becomes a form of counter space when the community there sort of reappropriates this particular development and says, well, yeah, I mean, we want to shop here, right? This is where we can buy our quinceañera, the dresses. This is where we come to eat. This is where we come to use public space. And so they reappropriate this particular development that was very much top down and make it into a counter space. And it's at that moment in which they make it into a counter space that the developers and other public officials come back and say, we got to destroy Fiesta Marketplace. We got to make it something else, right? And so Fiesta Marketplace is no longer this colorful built environment, specifically representing Mexican culture with Mexican restaurants and Mexican stores, quinceañera dress shops. But it's now, you know, envisioning itself as sort of the Brooklyn in downtown Santa Ana, right? And actually, the last time I was there was a store called Brooklyn. So there are ways in which these developments flip-flop over time, right? They start out as these top-down manifestations, and then people reappropriate them, right? Some of the most marginalized members of our communities reappropriate them, and that's when it becomes threatening to a lot of the folks in power, right? Because the initial project of whitening via Latinization has not panned out. So they need to rework it again.
Great, thank you for that answer. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, great, that means that I have a follow-up question, Johana. So if that's the case, right, then what does Latinidad and some people on here, and I think Jaden is on here, who's a grad student, right? We've been talking about the problems with that term and representation. And given the fact that you're looking at places like Union City, Lower East Side, Santa Ana, and Texas, right? Like Latinidad means so many different things in all of those places. So what does it mean to think about barrios or aesthetics and the built environment from a perspective of Latinidad that isn't sort of swallowed up by whiteness, right? Into that sort of the dream of white modernity. Like, what would it look like to think about cities and spaces that are not victimized by that kind of desire for whiteness?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to keep unpacking what Latinidad means. Don't take it for granted that there's this one definition to Latinidad, right? But that it's a process, right? It's always in process. And there are various actors involved. You know, as I was saying in the opening of today's event, right? There are non-Latinx actors involved in the creation of Latinidad and the Latinization of cities. And there are also Latinx people involved with varying degrees of political power and opinions, right? So I think that's what's at the center of sort of our rethinking of Latinidad, which I think is very important for us to continue to talk about, right? Like, what does it mean? Who's involved? And what are the stakes of it, right? And I think that looking at the built environment in particular is important because the built environment is static, right? For the most part, it's a visual representation. And in that visual representation, there's a lot that gets stereotyped, right? That gets fixed. And so while we think about the built environment, we also need to think about what surrounds the built environment, the processes that are behind the formation of that built environment in order to get to a much more nuanced understanding of the degree to which that built environment can actually represent Latinidad. Because otherwise we get tricked. We get tricked into believing that what we're seeing is representative of the politics of that community, right? Or is representative of the identity of that community. And I think that for me, starting out on the project, it was moving against that, right? Is sort of challenging those notions that just because we see the Virgin Mary on the front yard, or the Colombian flag, or the Mexican flag, or bright colors, doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's voices are being included, right? Or that people are able to express themselves in urban space.
Thank you. Okay. Let's see, Joanne, you have your hand raised. Another question.
Yeah, but only if nobody.
Oh, please, please.
I wanted you, in the book, you also talk a bit about kind of transnational connections. And I was wondering, I mean, going off of kind of Juan's last question and your wonderful answer, right? How then these conceptions of Latinidad are kind of pouring beyond the borders of the US, right? Like, is it changing concepts of Latinidad and presentations of Latinidad in Latin America, right? Where there are also these kind of tourist-centered barrios that also sell authentic Latinidad in certain ways. And of course, these people are working back and forth and communicating with designers and urban planners in other places as well. So just kind of wanted to hear about that.
Yeah, this is something that I'm increasingly interested in, that I don't really get a chance to talk about much in the book. But I've been following a lot of sort of Colombian reggaeton artists, and how they are, like Maluma and J Balvin, and how they are using the barrio in ways that approximates the definitions of barrios that we use in the United States, but that historically are actually very different from how the barrio has been defined and used in common everyday kind of context in Colombia, where the barrio can be a wealthy barrio, it can be a low-income barrio. I mean, it just means neighborhood, right, for a lot of Colombians. But through the use of reggaeton, through the appropriation of hip hop and hip hop cultures, they're beginning to more narrowly define and racialize the barrio as a ghetto, right, in particular places of Colombia. And so I think that's a really fascinating process that I really want to keep thinking about. I mean, in terms of the book, one of the transnational instances that comes out and sort of jumps at me at the moment is the chapter on Santa Ana, right? Because Fiesta Marketplace in downtown Santa Ana was inspired by Tijuana. So these public officials, developers, and local business people go down to Tijuana to think about what kind of architecture would be most authentic for downtown Santa Ana, right? And in doing so, it's my argument that they are sort of pushing aside the kinds of contributions of local Latinx people, of local Mexicans, right? And sort of favoring this transnational language, this Latin American Spanish colonial language as representative of US Latinx people. And we see that happening not only in Fiesta Marketplace in downtown Santa Ana, but also in some malls that start popping up in the early 2000s in the US South, in South Carolina, for instance. We see this happening in other places throughout the United States, where Spanish colonial architecture based out of towns in Mexico or other places in Latin America are being replicated in the United States as a form of local Latinx, authentic urban space.
Those are both fascinating projects that we hope manifest into writing. So thank you very much for that question. I love that question. George, we have a couple of minutes. We have a few minutes left, but George, you're up next.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me in reading over your book again and thinking about some of the characters is I was thinking about the Smithsonian, an institution you know well, and particularly the role of Henry Muñoz, who is central in that chapter, but he also spent 2 years as head of the working group working on the Museum of the American Latino. And I guess now that it's been approved and there are people starting to gather around this kind of concept, a national museum to commemorate, to understand the place of the American Latino, is there a cautionary tale here that you'd like to kind of talk about in relationship to museums that try to take this kind of concept and then apply it in some fundamental way? Is there something to be learned from Henry Muñoz's particular role, but also more generally what it means to try to abstract the American Latino into a national museum of some sort?
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it's like hot pink in the middle of the mall. And actually, I would welcome that. I think that would be fantastic. And in part, in saying this, I just want to underscore that I'm not necessarily against bright color, right? I think that bright color can be used as a form of resistance, right? As a critique of the normativity of our built space, right? That normativity that's supposed to be reflective of Eurocentric values. And so, I end the book with an example of the border wall, which was designed by architects in both the United States, but in collaboration with architects in Mexico. And what they come up with is a hot pink border wall, right? That is also a prison, right? And so I think it's what we need to make sure is that it keeps its sort of critical urgency, right? That it's not just bright color for the sake of replicating some sort of stereotyped version of an acceptable Latinx culture that whites can gather around and say, oh, look beautiful, so seductive, right? But a bright color that can say, we're here, we want to be heard, and you're going to have to deal with us, kind of thing. Right? So, yeah, I mean, in terms of Henry Munoz in the museum, I wouldn't be surprised if it's hot pink, because that seems to be a color that he really likes. I think Kathleen has her hand up. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm just like reinvigorated and inspired by it. I think a lot about how we feel in the built environment. And I know anxieties is something that is brought up in your work. And so I just wondered, kind of in an open way, like how did you, or at what moments in doing the research did you think about how we feel in spaces? Sorry, I'm looking this way because you're here, but my camera's here. And just what, if any, like affective geographies came up and how you thought through that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it was always there. I don't think I write about it extensively or theorize it in ways that I think it deserves to be theorized, but it was definitely always there in how I felt and how, where I thought I belonged, right? Like in terms of navigating these Eurocentric spaces in New York City, I always felt like maybe those spaces weren't for me, right? Like I was there, I was passing through them, but I didn't necessarily feel a connection to them. Whereas when I would go back to the barrio that I grew up in, that connection was always there, right? But, you know, in doing the research, it was always about interrogating why I felt so connected to that space, right? And who was creating the context that made me feel connected to it, right? And was I sort of buying into some built form that was actually trying to interpolate me, or was my connection to that particular space real and deserving of my allegiance to it, right? So I think how we feel in the built environment is so important. And I think it really, I mean, at least in my opinion, it really influenced how and why I chose the particular topics that I chose to focus on.
Great. I
Thank you
think
for
we're
that.
just about out of time. I want to thank both Johana Londoño and George Sánchez. First, Johana, for writing such a fantastic book and for joining us today, and George for having this great conversation. Before I go, is there anything else either one of you want to say before we leave?
I just want to thank all of you for such a fun event, and just I'm really honored to be in dialogue with all of you. Again, Professor Sánchez, whose work I really admire, and everyone else for your questions. Thank you so much.
Great. George, any final thoughts, comments?
Just get the book, buy it. Great book.
Great. Thank you all very much for joining us. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Oh, thank you so much. Bye.